test, test. Mark, does this work?
Yeah, that works.
James, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah, that's much better, George. Good job.
Okay. All right. Yeah, apologies. It's always quite a challenge to get the audio system to work for a hybrid webinar. Okay. Yes, good to see everyone.
Good to see you, George.
We should mute the Taipei audience feed.
我们3个人在这边只能要讲话，只有那个人能开，对，其他都要 mute， 对 ，otherwise 他们会很吵。
So we are almost at time. If I push us live, are we set, George? Are you going to run this, or is it Steve? I just want to make sure if I go live when we're ready that we're all set to, that everyone knows what they're doing.
Okay, so I will moderate the event. So just let me double check with everyone at the LY that we are ready to go live. Yeah?
Okay, I won't do anything until you tell me.
Okay, thank you.
确认一下都 OK 对不对？要 go live 咯，美国要 everything OK right？ 好，都没有问题了，对不对？可以了，都好，可以 ，perfect。
Okay, Mark, I think we're ready to go live.
Okay, and just a reminder, audience members from Zoom will type their questions in the Q&A box. The Zoom audience won't be on the screen. It's just us that are on the screen.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to mute my video and I'll start the webinar. Good luck, everybody.
All right, greetings, everyone. I'm the moderator for today's panel, George Jin. Welcome to the Harvard Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies panel on cross-strait relations 1 year after
Recording in progress.
Greetings, everyone. I'm the moderator for today's panel, George Jin. Welcome to the Harvard Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies panel on cross-strait relations 1 year after Biden's election. This is a timely panel. As you probably know, Biden and Xi are having a virtual summit today. It is likely that they will discuss Taiwan during the summit. This is the first time for the Harvard Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies to host a hybrid seminar in Taiwan's Legislative Yuan. Sitting beside me is Congressman and former KND Chairperson Johnny Zhang. Hello. And Congressperson Mark Ho.
Hi, everybody. Allow me to speak in Mandarin for now. 我万分荣幸可以跟全球最权威的学者还有我的好同事，也是国民党前主席江启臣呢，共同讨论美中台的问题。那在这样的跨党派，象征着国内对于务实稳定具有高度的共识。那美中台的关系呢，台湾对内对外要展现决心，那台海之间要有包容性，才能够减少误判。那接下来的时间，我很庆幸的，也很开心，抱持一个学习的心跟大家学习。那我即将阐述可预测性还有务实性。谢谢大家 ，Thank you guys.
Okay, return to English for now. Okay, so this is a rare occasion where we have Taiwanese legislators from 2 opposing parties appear on the same panel to talk about cross-strait relations. It is great that this event will enable a much-needed discussion between the 2 parties, but I also expect some sparks.
So, Congressperson Zhang, if I may invite you to say a few words as well.
Okay, can everyone hear me? All right. Okay. So hello everyone. Thank you for having me here today. I'm currently the RC legislator and serving on the Committee of National Defense and Foreign this is my third term as elected legislator from Taichung, which is central part in Taiwan. And I recently just resigned from the KMT chairmanship last month. Today, I, as a former amphibious recon special forces soldier and the current ROC legislator, I would be try to express my personal thoughts on the current situation in the Taiwan Strait. And again, no, I know, but I mean, I just want to
say some few words to thank Harvard Fairbanks Centers to have this kind of meeting between the U.S. and Taiwan, and hopefully we can have a very fruitful discussion today. Thank you.
All right. So actually, Congressman Cole, I know you just gave a few words in Chinese, but do you want to say a few words of welcome in English to everyone, please?
Sure. It's an honor for me to be here to learn from the best expertise in this panel. And then in following times, I look forward to learn from you guys. Thank you so much.
Okay, so I wanted to remind everyone who is attending the event, in person, to please enjoy the coffee and the breakfast. So they are kindly sponsored by William Lai, Lai Qingde, a Harvard alumnus in his personal capacity. All right, so now let me give the floor to Professor Stephen Goldstein, who is also the director for the Taiwan Studies Workshop, to give us a few words of welcome and to jumpstart our panel discussion.
Thanks very much, George. And thank you to you and the Li Faiyuan and all the people that have helped you put this together. In December of 2003, during his meeting with Wen Jiabao at the White House, George Bush said, quote, "We oppose any lateral decision by either China or Taiwan to change the status quo." At the end of last month, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is reported to have made it, quote, "crystal clear," unquote, in his talks with Wang Yi that the United States opposed any unilateral change to the status quo. Is this evidence of a consistent, crystal clear American position on the cross-strait question? Or is it the expression of a weak policy in the Taiwan Strait in 2003, the same as the status quo today? And the answer is obvious, it's not. If that is the case, then what's the meaning of status quo? Well, status quo simply means the existing situation. It's a concept without a content. One way of giving it content would be to devise a continuum that ranges from stable status quo on the one end, where all involved parties accept and support the current situation, to a conflictual status quo on the other end, where all parties reject the existing situation and are in conflict. To go one step further with this analogy, I would argue that in the years since 2003, the indicator of status quo has moved in the direction away from the stable pole and towards the conflictual pole. In 2003, the status quo in the Strait was one of mutual frustration. Neither Taiwan nor China could achieve its desired outcome, and the United States remained in the middle of a continuing manifestation of the Chinese Civil War. However, a common desire to avoid armed conflict generated implicit and explicit rules of behavior that allowed the status quo frustration to be managed. In the years since 2003, changes have occurred in the area. China under Xi Jinping adopted a more assertive external policy. The Trump administration adopted an increasingly confrontational policy toward China, and both used policy towards Taiwan as an instrument to express opposition of the other. I'll repeat that. Both are using Taiwan as an instrument to express opposition towards the other. Taiwan, at the same time, has taken a less passive position in the triangle, seeking to take advantage of Sino-American differences. A status quo of mutual antagonism has emerged as the rules that made earlier management possible have been undermined. We've recently heard about actions in the so-called gray zone, that is, competitive actions between war and peace, such as the ADIZ flights of the PRC. Let me suggest a different zone, the red zone. In American football, the red zone designates the last 20 yards on the 100-yard field before crossing into the end zone. It seems to me that the danger in the status quo today is that all three actors are pursuing policies that are challenging the rules that made the previous management of status quo of mutual frustration possible, with actions in the red zone. And these actions in the red zone are moving the needle towards a conflictual end of the status quo spectrum. Our colleague and friend, the late Alan Romberg, wrote a book entitled Reign at the Brink of the Precipice that warned of the dangers that could result from mismanagement of the cross-strait question. We should heed that warning today. There is nothing inevitable about war in the Taiwan Strait. The crisis today is a crisis of management. It's a crisis of mismanagement of a difficult issue, and the present status quo is not anything that any party should seek to sustain. However, the formulaic recognition of the importance of upholding the status quo on the part of the current administration is not only dangerous, but I think exposes the poverty of diplomatic efforts in the area. What can be done? To be sure, given the events of the recent past, it will not be easy to move the needle back in the direction of a less confrontational status quo. The challenges are greater than in the past. Domestic factors, Chinese nationalism, anti-Chinese sentiment in the United States, and growing Taiwan identity all limit diplomatic flexibility. However, on the most fundamental level, a significant start would be if the Taiwan issue would cease to be a surrogate in the Sino-American conflict, as was the case during the 1950s, and be treated by all sides as a complex and dangerous historical legacy that needs careful and skillful diplomatic managing. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for your insightful presentation.
And skillful diplomatic managing. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, for your insightful presentation.
You're muted, George.
Right. Okay, does this work now? Okay.
There's a lot of echo.
Yes. Harvard.
Well, thank you very much, George. Thanks for inviting me. 我非常高兴有这个机会跟你们交换意见，深表我的谢意。So I want to talk about the ambiguity of strategic clarity. In US policy, strategic ambiguity is supposed to create dual deterrence. This is in Richard Bush's words. Deterrence of the PRC and deterrence of Taiwan's de jure independence. These are supposed to be connected. US resolve to use force through, although operationally ambiguous, reduces the probability of a PRC attack, and the deterrence of Taiwan de jure independence reduces PRC incentives to use force because it signals reassurance from the United States that independence won't happen. So dual deterrence reflects the two components of deterrence as developed by the Nobel Prize winner in economics, Thomas Schelling, namely credible threats of force plus credible offers of reassurance equals enhanced deterrence. But dual deterrence hypothesis at the heart of strategic ambiguity has never really been tested. And critics of ambiguity say that strategic clarity, a clear commitment to the military defense of Taiwan is better for deterrence. But the advocates of strategic clarity tend to ignore the reassurance part of dual deterrence, namely that the US should also deter Taiwan independence, de jure independence. So based on two survey experiments, one we conducted in November 2019 and the other in November 2020 that Tsai Jiahong from the Election Studies Center at Zhengda, George Yin, Steve Goldstein, and me, we conducted survey experiments to test how ambiguity versus clarity of the US military commitment to Taiwan's defense affects Taiwanese attitudes towards willingness to fight and towards support for independence. In the November 2019 survey, some people were given a scenario where the PRC uses force. The US is hesitant, however, to respond. Other people in the survey were given a scenario where the PRC uses force, but the US defends Taiwan, or they believe the United States will defend Taiwan. We also varied whether the PRC use of force comes after a declaration of de jure independence or not. We found that when people are certain that the United States will defend Taiwan, so strategic clarity, they are more willing to fight China if China attacks, which is of course good for deterrence. Now, let me just share screen for a moment. I wouldn't be an academic if I didn't have figures. Okay, so this shows the results of the a test of the willingness to fight to defend Taiwan if the PRC attacks. People were given a choice of very unwilling through to, very willing to very willing. Sorry, this should be willing. And we looked at the difference between supporters of the KMT and supporters of the DPP. One of the conditions was that there had been a declaration of independence before the PRC uses force, and one condition is there was no declaration of independence before the PRC uses force, and the other condition was the US hesitates to defend Taiwan, and the other condition is that the US is certain to defend Taiwan. What we found was, for example, in the KMT, among KMT supporters, when independence had been declared ahead of time and the PRC attacked, but the US was hesitant to intervene, there was a relatively low level of willingness to fight in defense of Taiwan. But if the United States' commitment to Taiwan was certain, or the US did defend Taiwan, the willingness to fight increases a little bit. The same effect occurred when there was no prior declaration of independence. People were more willing to fight when they were certain the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan. Now, we didn't see much of an effect on supporters of the DPP because, in general, supporters of the DPP express greater willingness to fight in the first place. Although there is a similar effect, again, when the United States commits to defend Taiwan, there is a slight increase in the willingness of DPP supporters to fight as well. The important difference here is that the conditions under which you're going to see the largest increase in the willingness to fight, at least for KMT supporters, is the difference between this condition and this condition. So this condition is when when Taiwan has already declared independence, but the United States hesitates. And this condition is when Taiwan has not declared independence, but the US intervention against China is certain. And you can see that that difference is a considerable increase in the willingness to fight. It constitutes about a 20% increase in the willingness to fight. So the US clarity increases support among KMT supporters or increases the willingness of KMT supporters to fight. We then looked at, in the 2020 survey, we looked at the question of the impact of strategic clarity on support for independence. So this is the dual deterrence component. And here we found that if people believe the United States will defend Taiwan, in other words, if people believe strategic clarity, then there is an overall increase in support for independence. Under conditions of US ambiguity, roughly just below 15% of respondents say they are very likely to declare independence in the face of a PRC military threat. And about just less than 25% say that they are somewhat likely to support independence in the face of a PRC threat. And that comes out to roughly a little bit less than 40% of respondents believe that they are likely or very likely to support independence if in the face of the PRC military threat, if the US commitment remains ambiguous. If the US commitment becomes clear, in other words, if there's strategic clarity, the proportion of respondents who support, who are likely to vote or favor independence increases, as does the percentage of people who are likely to support independence in the face of a military threat. And this increase comes to roughly, roughly 47% of respondents are willing to support independence in the face of a military threat. So conditions of US clarity increase the willingness of Taiwanese voters to support independence. This effect is the greatest when you look at, for example, supporters of the DPP. So here this is US military support is ambiguous, and obviously overwhelmingly supporters of the DPP are willing to support independence in the face of the PRC military threat. When the US support becomes clear, you can see that the percentage of DPP supporters who are highly likely to support independence increases substantially, increases about 10 percentage points when strategic clarity is in place. And in fact, that increase in support, in highly likely support for independence, is a function of a reduction in those who are likely to support. So basically, people's opinions shift towards a greater willingness to support independence in the face of a military threat from the PRC. So I'll stop sharing. So these findings suggest that strategic clarity could help deterrence by increasing the willingness of the population to fight. But it could also reduce deterrence by reducing the PRC's confidence that the US defense of Taiwan won't increase the probability of independence. In other words, the effects of clarity on deterrence, strategic clarity on deterrence, are in fact ambiguous. But what the survey does suggest is, and this is consistent with Schelling's logic about deterrence, is that if the US wants to maximize deterrence, that is, if it wants to reduce the probability of China's use of force, it has to both be clear to the PRC about the US willingness to defend Taiwan, and the US has to be credibly clear that it does not support independence. And here the Biden administration seems to be taking a somewhat unbalanced position, somewhat like the Trump administration. There is less reassurance of the PRC that the US is trying to deter Taiwan independence. There's only been one, as far as I know, one reaffirmation of the longtime US policy by Kirk Campbell in July of this year, that the US does not support de jure independence. And I believe, I'm not certain, but I don't believe there's been any other public statements since then specifically saying the US does not support de jure independence. And in fact, the imbalance in the Biden position is embodied in recent statements by Blinken that only focus on the PRC threat to change the status quo through the use of force, but don't focus on the threat of de jure independence to the status quo as the US has defined the status quo. So the survey results in the logic of deterrence therefore suggest that to reduce the probability of PRC attack, the US has to rebalance its dual deterrence policy it has to demonstrate a credible clarity about military support for Taiwan and a credible clarity about not supporting, perhaps even opposing de jure Taiwan independence. So I will stop there. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Yan, for your presentation. So next we'll have Professor Sarah Newland from Smith College to give us our next presentation. Sarah, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel. So this year, Taiwan's international space has received a lot of attention, focusing primarily on the international level, the ways in which Taiwan has been kind of shut out of formal participation in UN programs, for instance, and also on the national level on this question of the closer bilateral ties with the US, for instance, that have been sort of running through some of the comments of the other folks on the panel. And my research takes a little bit of a different approach by examining Taiwan's international participation at the subnational level. So some of my research looks at things like Taiwan's participation in sister city and sister state agreements, driver's license reciprocity agreements with states in the US and elsewhere, visits by state governors and state legislative delegations to Taiwan, and city and state trade promotion and economic development offices in Taiwan. And so what I want to talk a little bit about today is that I see these as a sort of important and pretty complicated site where the cross-strait relationship is being contested, even though many of these sites are geographically quite far from the Taiwan Strait. When I started doing research on this topic, some of my interviewees were somewhat pessimistic about Taiwan's ability to continue signing new paradiplomatic or sort of subnational diplomatic agreements as pressure from the PRC to try to sort of shrink Taiwan's international space has increased. And this was really only a few years ago. But in to pass, as anti-China sentiment has grown in some quarters of the world and certainly in the United States, there seems to be continuing interest in partnering with localities in Taiwan or with Taiwan as a whole, and in some cases also growing skepticism toward or opposition toward partnering with Chinese localities. So a couple of examples since the Biden presidency began, the US states of Arizona and New Mexico have signed new trade deals with Taiwan. The city of Taoyuan recently signed a sister city agreement with Newark, New Jersey. And these kinds of agreements, in some ways, they seem like sort of friendly, unimportant person-to-person relationships, but officials from the PRC tend to get pretty worked up when these agreements are signed. As one recent example, the PRC consulate in Vancouver recently issued a statement objecting to a sister city agreement between Vancouver and Kaohsiung, which was baffling to some people because no such agreement has been announced or proposed. But even the idea that there might be this kind of agreement between a city in Taiwan and a city elsewhere often results in, at the very least, a sort of forceful public statement. So I want to talk a little bit about some ways in which these forms of subnational diplomacy present both opportunities and also some challenges as Taiwan seeks to kind of navigate and expand its international space. So in terms of opportunities, I think these provide useful venues via which Taiwan has been able to successfully highlight its kind of good diplomacy in the world. So its use of mask diplomacy, for instance, donating masks to localities around the world, has been a useful way to show that Taiwan is a kind of good global citizen and to forge direct links with particular localities that are benefiting from some of those programs. These kinds of subnational linkages also can provide a useful way to start to form relationships with city and state officials in the United States and elsewhere who then sometimes rise up to positions of national importance and kind of carry a close relationship with Taiwan with them as they go to Washington. They can be opportunities to sort of raise Taiwan's profile and allow Taiwan to kind of perform the act of being like a state in the world without ever needing to declare independence. So often there are public ceremonies with a US flag and an ROC flag next to each other in kind of equal standing as these agreements are signed. At the same time, though, there are significant challenges that engaging in this kind of diplomacy can pose. One of these challenges is that foreign policy expertise at the local level can be quite thin. And as Professor Goldstein was highlighting before, these are complicated times, and the diplomatic challenges involved in navigating the cross-strait relationship are extremely complex. And sometimes questions related to those relationships and the potential the sort of pressure that localities might find themselves facing from PRC officials if they choose to sign an agreement with Taiwan. These are things that local officials in the States and elsewhere are sometimes poorly equipped to handle. They often don't know very much about the history that they're kind of walking into. And in some cases, those local officials have then signed on to agreements that seem to commit themselves to, for instance, a version of the One China policy that is inconsistent with the US's stated One China policy. I think another challenge of paradiplomacy is that often, especially in federal systems or other places where localities have significant autonomy, the interests of local governments and the national government are not necessarily aligned. And so sometimes localities are compelled for economic reasons or convinced for economic reasons to sign on to subnational agreements that might be inconsistent with the sort of broader security aims of the country of which they're a part. And so I think one example of this in the last year was the agreement between Victoria in Australia and China as part of a Belt and Road Initiative program. This agreement was ultimately canceled by the Australian government on the grounds that it was a national security concern. But I think often localities are looking primarily for their economic interests when they sign on to some of these agreements, and can sometimes intentionally or unintentionally sort of undercut the security policy that's being set by the national government. And finally, I think that the sort of process of democratization in Taiwan and more generally democratic politics in Taiwan, in the US, and in some of Taiwan's other partners can make the process of navigating these subnational relationships somewhat complicated. In the 1980s, when Taiwan first began really investing in subnational diplomacy, it really was sort of dictated in a fairly top-down way, where the national government could sort of articulate goals for particular cities to sign sister city agreements and make that happen. But that's much less the case today. And it's important, I think, for cities to have buy-in, both from local officials who have to see a kind of payoff to themselves of investing in these relationships, whether it's that they think there will be an electoral benefit to themselves or some, benefit to their voters. They need to think these relationships are worth investing in. City councils need to be convinced that it's worth ponying up the money. And this is true both on the US side and on the Taiwan side, and also in the case of other places that might be partnering with Taiwan. And so, I think that creates some complexities where there are significant numbers of sister city and sister state relationships that Taiwan is involved in that are what are sometimes called sleeper cities. So they're relationships that exist on paper, but don't really have very much meaningful, don't create very many meaningful opportunities for exchange. And so they could be a more useful site, more fruitful site of sort of cooperation between Taiwan and some of its partners and allies than they are at the current moment. I think the other challenge is that open democratic politics mean that groups that want to have a closer relationship with Taiwan can have a say, and also groups that want to keep Taiwan out of politics can have a say. And so in some cases, I think officials from the PRC have been effective at trying to mobilize pressure against cities that might be pursuing some sort of sister city arrangement with Taiwan. So I will end there. I'm so curious to hear what some of the other speakers have to say. Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Sarah. That's fascinating research. So, Congressman Ho, it's rumored that he might be running for the mayor of Taipei, in the next election. So, if he should hire you as a consultant if he does decide to run and does get elected. All right. On that note, now let's shift to our Taiwanese participants. So we'll have Professor Xu Siqing from NTU to give us our first presentation from the Taiwanese perspective.
Okay, thank you, George. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to join this very timely and meaningful event. I'll speaking first on the current cross-strait political dialogue, and then on the Taipei's and Washington's efforts to maintain the status quo. Since her first inauguration in 2016, President Tsai Ing-wen has refrained from recognizing the 1992 consensus, as we all know. But we all should also note the fact that, while doing this, President Tsai Ing-wen did not deny it flatly, as President Chen Shui-bian did many years ago. Well, this is undoubtedly one of the key reasons why Beijing has condemned Taipei of pursuing Taiwan independence and launched mounting military, economic, and diplomatic pressures on Taiwan. For Beijing, no meaningful contacts, dialogues, or exchanges are possible without Taipei's accepting it in the first place. Yet for the DPP administration, whether the cross-strait status quo is premised, among other things, on the principle of one China, which is a core element integral to the 1992 consensus, is to be negotiated instead of being taken as a precondition for dialogues with Beijing. There's evidently a zero-sum game in such a political deadlock. Xi Jinping, on the other hand, as I mentioned, took a lot of high risk-taking actions, such as the mounting diplomatic and military pressures on Taiwan. And his high risk-taking propensity, showing all the coercions on Taiwan that puts the possibility of cross-strait armed conflict in the global limelight, can be understood from two angles grounded in the so-called prospect theory in international relations. Prospect theory posits that high risk-taking propensity often ensues in order to prevent the drift toward further losses. So first, the rising US support for Taiwan along various fronts during not only the Trump, but also especially the Biden administrations, points to a strong likelihood of Beijing's increasing losses in the near future. And second, Taiwan's people's political identity is also increasingly inimical to an association with China. For example, while the overwhelming majority of Taiwan people still favors refraining from either unification or Taiwan independence, there is a different sort of a trend going on along the identity dimension. Among the three options of political identity in Taiwan's poll, for example, exclusive Taiwanese identity has continuously widened its lead ahead of dual identity, which corresponds roughly to the maintenance of status quo, while exclusive Chinese identity, which is the least popular alternative, has kept shrinking. Therefore, it is likely that as time goes by, Beijing will face greater losses over the appeal of its peaceful unification bid to Taiwan people. So these are the two sort of explanations for the high-risk propensity undertaken by Xi Jinping. A key issue now in the domestic political debate between the blue and the green camps in Taiwan is to what extent or whether or not Taipei should maintain or go back to the 1992 consensus. But how helpful is it for Taipei to re-embrace either minimally or partially or completely the 1992 consensus to alleviate the growing risk of war between Taiwan and China? Well, I think it will not be useless at all, unlike what the green camp posits, but unfortunately also maybe of quite limited utility, unlike what the blue camps posits. A much obscured reality in Taiwan's internal political debate is that Xi Jinping himself does not seem to regard the status quo enshrined by the 1992 consensus as an acceptable and durable equilibrium in the foreseeable future. Among myriad indications of Xi's standpoint on this issue is his defining statement on the 1st of January 2019 in commemoration of the 40th anniversary of Beijing's promulgation of its one country, two system formula for the unification between Taiwan and China. In that speech, in addition to Beijing's long-standing emphasis on the prevention of Taiwan independence, preservation of the option of use of force, and promotion of cross-strait cooperation and exchanges, Xi further worsened cross-strait tensions for at least 3 reasons. First, he stressed the inevitability of ultimate unification, which is to be fulfilled as soon as possible. Second, he asserted that cross-strait political differences are not to be left unresolved infinitely, alluding to the desirability of a timetable for unification. And finally, the maintenance of the 1992 consensus appears no longer a leading goal in its own right, but just a premise or tentative arrangement before unification is achieved. All the 3 elements here have been increasingly emphasized in various party-state documents or addresses subsequently until now. It is therefore worth pondering if any national leader in Taiwan in the next 5 to 10 years recognize the 1992 consensus again, and if Beijing's current aggressiveness in attaining unification does not change, will the 1992 consensus in preserving status quo still be so effective? So I think that's a big question that all of us should really ponder. And finally, let me talk a little bit about Washington's and Taipei's efforts to preserve cross-strait peace and stability. So based on the reasoning above, President Biden's ever-growing political, economic, and military backing of Taiwan generates much more positive than negative effects on maintaining cross-strait peace and stability. For the benefit of time, let me just discuss the vital issue of strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity, which Professor Johnston also talks in detail moments ago. As we know, the long-standing US strategic ambiguity is intended chiefly to attain the dual deterrence of both Beijing's and Taipei's destabilizing moves. What the Biden administration has been doing is adherence to strategic ambiguity in words on the one hand, but a drift towards strategic clarity in deeds on the other. And of course, this drift towards strategic clarity is pretty much in the favor of Taiwan. This seems to remain to a reasonable degree effective to deter Beijing, but also leave the Taiwan people not completely sure about the chance of US coming to Taiwan's defense in the event of China's invasion. And here, of course, leaving the Taiwan people more than leaving the Taipei government to guess the US intention is much more important, because ultimately speaking, the pursuit of Taiwan independence hinges much more on Taiwan's public opinion than on the ROC government's unilateral action. On the other hand, a somewhat different case is Washington's recent call for Taipei's wider and more substantive participation in the UN system of international organizations. To be sure, this is highly welcomed by the ROC government and people. Yet, once this is really realized in any fashion, deemed by Taiwan as meaningful, Beijing may be left with little choice but to react very violently. Let's consider the case of the proposed visit by the then US Ambassador, Ms. Kelly Craft, to Taiwan earlier this year. Okay, we know that finally that visit was canceled because of reasons we all are aware of. And let's consider the relative severity of that case compared to Taiwan's participation in the UN system. So we can understand how serious it could be for Beijing if Taiwan really enters into the UN systems of international organizations. Okay, So that sort of initiative from Washington does not seem to be really the benefit of maintaining cross-strait peace and stability. On the part of Taiwan, the ongoing efforts, perhaps also including reasonable expansion of the duration for Taiwan's military service to strengthen self-defense capability, are all necessary. On the other hand, this recent initiative from the demonstrations about the so-called constitutional revision is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it may improve the robustness of the ROC's political institutions at internal dimension. On the other hand, it may also provide munitions for fervents or hardliners in the Green Camp to pursue de jure independence. Finally, offensive capability through, for instance, missiles able to fly across the Taiwan Strait and Taiwan's drones oriented toward attacking missions may be vital, not for the purpose of invading China, but only for the purpose of deterring the intention for Beijing to invade Taiwan. Okay, so I think I stop here. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Professor Shi, for your excellent presentation. So now we'll have Professor Tao, also from NTU Political Science, to give us her presentation. Professor Tao, now you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, George. It's really my pleasure to be part of this very timely webinar. Yeah, I think it has been so often for us to see Taiwan on the front page of newspapers in the West, to be portrayed as the most dangerous place in the world. But as we all know, Taiwanese people are very friendly. Taiwan itself is not dangerous at all. But Taiwan now is faced with the most dangerous possibility of a hegemonic power transition war between the US and China. And I totally agree with Professor Goldstein that Taiwan should not be treated as the surrogate of the superpower competition between the US and China. So in my presentation, I will try to be zooming out a little bit to the broader context of the superpower competition between China and the US. So how to maintain the status quo? I think first we must identify where is the challenge of the status quo from? And my answer is very simple. I think Xi Jinping's China is the answer, is the challenge. I will explain why Xi's China is challenging the status quo. And then I will talk about, in my estimation, what is Biden administration's strategy in response to Xi Jinping's challenge, and why Taiwan has become the focal point of maintaining the status quo, and what opportunity and risk this situation has brought to Taiwan. When Xi Jinping came to power in 2012, he had totally opposite perceptions of the CCP's status at home and abroad. Domestically, he was afraid that the CCP is on the verge of collapse. As revealed later, he had studied the reason why the former Soviet Union collapsed for years. His conclusion is that because they didn't care about party members' ideology anymore, no one is willing to fight for the party. However, externally, like most Chinese political elite, Xi Jinping was convinced after the 2008 financial crisis, American hegemony is in decline. China has never had a better chance to replace the US to be the dominant power in Asia at least. In response to these totally opposite perceptions, Xi Jinping, departing from Deng Xiaoping's Taoguang Yanghui strategy, decided to promote nationalism instead of economic growth as the source of the party's performance legitimacy. Deng Xiaoping made China rich, and Xi Jinping will make China strong. 邓小平让中国富起来，习近平要让中国强起来。In order to make China strong, he has to enhance his personal control over the party. and the party's control over the country. Xi Jinping used his first term to consolidate his power domestically, and then he started his second term by a series of crackdown of financial firms following kidnapping Xiao Jianhua from Hong Kong. He also had written his thoughts into the CCP constitution and abolished term limit for the president by amending the PRC constitution. And then after the US President Trump launched a trade war with China, his sense of urgency is even stronger. On the one hand, he started to promote economic self-reliance in response to Trump's trade war. On the other hand, he seemed to conclude that the US is in further decline and started to talk about 世界百年未有之大变局, the great changes in the world unseen in a century, implying that China might take the chance to replace the US global leadership in foreseeable future. He ended his second term with destroying one country, two systems in Hong Kong, raising military tensions with neighbor countries from Japan, South Korea to India, and exercise coercive diplomacy against Australia, the US, and those European countries who are critical to Chinese government's treatment of the investigation of COVID virus origins and the minorities' human rights. In general, Xi Jinping's being increasingly authoritarian at home and aggressively internationally resulted in a paradigm shift in global politics, especially obvious in countries like Australia, Japan, and South Korea. No matter their government or the government behavior or public opinions, we can see this paradigm shift or sea change in these countries. They all are convinced by Xi Jinping's aggression that the liberal international order is under serious challenge from China. The liberal world led by the US must do something. So now I will turn to Biden administration's strategy in response to China's aggression. Biden administration's national security team already formed their view of China during the Trump administration. Since Kurt Campbell and Eli Ratner published the very famous China Reckoning article on foreign affairs in 2017, Kurt Campbell has published several articles on foreign affairs with different authors, such as Jack Sullivan and Raj Doshi. All of them are now in Biden's national security team. And after Biden came to power, this team quickly came up with the interim national security strategic guidance in March this year as a guidance for the administration's foreign policy when they are still working on this administration's national security in the first year. In the front page of the interim guidance, it states, our world is at an inflection point. The main message of the guidance is democracy is under threat, facing a fierce competition from authoritarianism, especially from China. The US must compete and will prevail through reform domestically and re-engage with like-minded allies and partners to demonstrate in Biden's world that democracy holds the key to freedom, prosperity, peace, and dignity. He says in the cover letter of the guidance, we must now demonstrate that democracy can still deliver for our people and for people around the world. On the same day, Blinken gave his first speech as the state secretary to explain how the Biden administration will carry out the interim guidance. In that speech, Blinken says, China is the only country with the economic, diplomatic, military, and technological power to seriously challenge the stable and open international system. The US approach to China will be competitive when it should be, collaborative when it can be, and adversarial when it must be. To sum up, Biden administration's approach to stopping China from challenging the status quo is to compete through domestic reforms on the one hand, and the re-engagement with allies and partners to defend liberal international order on the other. Since then on, in the international front, through the Quad leaders' virtual meeting in March, a summit with Japanese Prime Minister Suga in April, summit with South Korea President Moon in May, and with G7 leaders and the EU leaders in June, the Quad real meeting and setting up the AUKUS in September, and last month, G20 and COP26. Biden administration has used the various bilateral and multilateral platforms to show that the US is still willing and able to take the leadership of international political order. How has China responded to Biden administration's strategy? In the beginning, as shown in the very public desktop in Anchorage, Alaska, in late March, when the top-ranking officials of both sides first met after Biden came to power, China was very furious and arrogant because during the time, Xi still believed it is an error for the East is rising, 东升西降. The US can't win the competition with China. But in the summer, when the Western countries seem to gradually recover from the pandemic, people's lives return to normal. China, on the other hand, although proud of their zero-case achievement, gradually feel the cost of tightening up control of the society and the economy. Rising income inequality, sharply declining birth rate, high defaulting rates of private enterprises and real estate developers. Xi Jinping seemed to realize that the US is not so easy to decline, and he decided to change gear of his nationalism campaign from 东升西降 to common prosperity, 共同富裕. A series of policies to crack down wildly growing private capitals made the domestic consumption and the investment even worse. China's recovery has to rely upon export even more. Therefore, we have heard less warrior wolf diplomacy in recent months and more reconciliatory rhetorics from top officials, even Xi Jinping himself. So finally, I will say why Taiwan has become the focal point of this superpower competition. Although Hong Kong was under China's sovereignty since 1997, it was still the Westerners' sphere of influence until 2020. Xi Jinping forcefully passed the national security law for Hong Kong, put an end to the one country, two systems, only 23 years after the turnover. In spite of the condemnations from the whole world, it seems to the world that China under Xi Jinping no longer care how the outside world thinks of China. China could do whatever they want. Implicitly, it is a big setback for the liberal international order under the US leadership. Therefore, more and more Western scholars on global politics, such as Neil Ferguson, Robert Kaplan, and John Mearsheimer, argue that if Taiwan becomes the next to be taken over by Beijing under the watch of the US, it will be the end of Pax Americana, just like the British Empire is over after losing Suez Canal to Egypt. The Biden administration seems to also perceive this paradigm shift. The war over Taiwan between the superpowers will be a hegemonic power transition war. Therefore, besides repeatedly warning China that the US still come to the U.S. will come to defend Taiwan if China attacks. The peace and the stability in the Taiwan Strait has been mentioned in a series of U.S.-initiated summer meeting statements. In the meetings between Biden and Sugar in April, between Biden and the Moon in May, and Biden with G7 and the EU in June. Becoming the focal point of the hegemonic power transition war provides Taiwan unprecedented opportunity and risk. For opportunity, Taiwan has never got such much attention in the world. People are more curious about Taiwan's unique history and identity. It's a great opportunity for Taiwan to let the world understand and sympathize Taiwan's cause. For risk, as both the US and Taiwan have more stake on the future of Taiwan, Taiwan might have less control of Taiwan's own future. Taiwan even will be forced into a war involuntarily. It is a very peculiar situation. I think both the incumbent and the opposition parties should deal with together. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tao, for your presentation. So I want to remind everyone in America that Professor Tao was also the senior advisor to the president on the National Security Council, so 国安会之一委员 for I think almost 2 years. So Professor Tao is one of the very rare species who's both an academic but also a policymaker. So on that note, I want to turn, give the floor to another one of these rare species, Congressperson Johnny Zhang, and former KNT chairman, who was also an academic before he, started a political career. So, Congressperson Zhang, now you have the floor.
Okay, thank you, George, and hello everyone. I think the topic we talk about today, or the thing what we just seen today, is all about power politics, or the hegemonic power transition process. So to start my point of view, I would say I would begin by sharing my views on Washington. Compared with the Trump administration, the Biden administration may seem quite dissimilar in terms of governing style. However, despite this distinction, Biden has mostly maintained his predecessor's policy toward Beijing. He has not reverted back to the Obama administration's conciliatory approach. As the Kirk Campbell stated earlier this year, engagement has come to an end. The dominant paradigm is going to be competition. This paradigm shift significantly impact the so-called status quo. It has triggered increased discussions over the merits of strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity for Washington regarding the defense of Taiwan. Further discussion has been triggered by Biden's flip-flopping on the issue as well. Last month, President Biden clearly stated that Washington has a commitment to come to Taiwan's defense if Beijing attacks. The White House later then backtracked, stating that there would be no change in policy. This backtracking has almost become a pattern. This flip-flopping not only reveals the limits of U.S. support for Taiwan, but also diminishes both the strategic and the ambiguity of the strategic ambiguity. Even Taiwan experts or supporters like Bonnie Glazers has just said a confused U.S. policy weakness deterrence. As you all know, President Biden is actually now teleconferencing with Xi Jinping right now. I am cautiously optimistic that despite their competition, Washington and Beijing are still maintaining open communication, because communication and dialogues are of all the most importance. I wholeheartedly hope that during the conference, Biden will communicate a consistent U.S. policy on Taiwan, which will be able to maintain the status quo, which has kept the peace across the Taiwan Strait for decades. This peace is our primary goal. The so-called status quo implies a static state of affairs, but there are two important shifting trends taking place in the Taiwan Strait. They are both far from static. The first trend is a sharp increase in tensions since 2016 between two societies on the two sides of the Taiwan Strait. Both Taipei and Beijing have been adopting more hardline policies, and this has led to these two societies becoming more and more confrontational with one another. The second shifting trend is the vastly increasing strength and sophistication of the PLA, not only vis-a-vis ROC armed forces, but in comparison with the US armed forces as well. These two shifting trends, an increase in confrontational attitudes and increasing imbalance of power, are on a collision course which greatly upset any so-called status quo. Earlier this month, US National Security Advisor Jack Sullivan stated that the US government does support the cross-strait status quo. If the status quo he referred to means neither unification nor independence, this makes sense. However, as increased military exercise also expand into the South China Sea, the unprecedented confrontation between Washington and Beijing has placed significant pressures on Taiwan. With the aforementioned increase in societal tension, military operations, and potential flashpoints in mind, I must express concerns as to whether the cross-strait status quo can truly be maintained. Even if the political status quo is being maintained, tensions continue to escalate. Will this escalation reach a breaking point or result in a grave military miscalculations? Given this concerning situation, my first instinct as a former Special Forces soldier would be to try and reduce tension in the Taiwan Strait to avert military conflict. The first, most fundamental step in these tension reductions is dialogue. As President Tsai stated in the CNN interview last month, more communication would be helpful so that we would reduce misunderstanding. I agree wholeheartedly, but I must ask, why is there no communication taking place so far? Former President Ma Ying-jeou, during his tenure, successfully met Xi Jinping in person. A similar meeting seems entirely far-fetched under the current administration. In any case, the current lack of communication means that the only option we have at the moment are military. As such, according to Foreign Policy magazine, and I quote, "The US is getting Taiwan ready to fight on the beach. Although we unequivocally must strengthen our self-defense and deterrence capabilities by continuing to procure arms from the United States, we must also understand that war is the last resort. If dialogue can be established, then Taipei could actively also work towards being the peacemaker between the Washington and Beijing. This role would be especially beneficial during this time of instability and escalating tensions. During acute disagreement between the two parties, a third-party intermediary has the potential to be instrumental in reducing friction, which is especially important because military conflict threatens the very survival of our nation and the life of over 23.5 million people. Our desire for peace, however, must not be conflict with subservience to Beijing. We have always been aligned with Washington because of our shared democratic values. However, this alliance does not mean that we should be Washington's proxy in a war. We must exercise all possible actions to avert calamity, and the first step to establish dialogue with Beijing Thank you.
Thank you, Congressperson Zhang. So now we'll turn the floor to Congressman Mark Ho. Mark, please.
All right, thank you, George, for hosting this event. First of all, allow me to express my gratitude. Many thanks for all the penetrating insights from the earlier panelists. Again, it's an honor to co-host this panel with Johnny Zhang Qichen, my dear colleague from Legislative Yuan and KMT's former chairman. The fact that Johnny and I are co-hosting this panel today symbolizes the bipartisan consensus on the importance of maintaining the status quo. However, this consensus, while significant, can obscure important differences, meaning of the status quo. The status quo may mean different things to different people. For some, maintaining the status quo means defending Zhonghua Republic of China. For some, maintaining the status quo means no unification, no independence, and no usage of force. And for me and the DPP, maintaining the status quo means safeguarding sovereignty of Taiwan and Taiwan's democratic way of life, which in Mandarin I would say 保卫台湾主权、民主及生活方式. And of course, this is no easy task for Taiwan at all, especially in this great power competitions. So as we all know, Taiwan is at the forefront of Sino-US rivalry. In my opinion, we can carry on based on two guiding principles to maintain the status quo. The first is the predictability, and the second one is pragmatism. Predictability means no accident and no miscalculation. We can think about predictability in this context from three angles. First, Taiwan needs to clearly demonstrate its resolve to defend itself, both to China and to our international friends. Taiwan's defense spending is at new high, and we have recently introduced various measures, strengthen basic military training. We can do more. Importantly, we should be bipartisan consensus on Taiwan's national defense strategy and commitment to update our defense capabilities, both in realm of conventional warfare and realm of information and cyber warfare. There is bipartisan consensus in Washington, D.C. to support Taiwan against Chinese encroachments. We must need a bipartisan consensus in Taipei to defend Taiwan's democracy. There should be no uncertainty regarding Taiwan's will to defend itself. And the second, from the predictability, the US and the international community need to clear signal to China that it will not accept any attempt by China to unilaterally change the status quo. I very much appreciate the Biden administration and Congress rock solid support for Taiwan. But I worry that China is still underestimating the US will defend Taiwan. Chinese nationalists are often quick to portray that US as a paper tiger that will abandon Taiwan if there's a crisis. There is a dangerous problem we need to address. So on this note, I want to emphasize that the US and its democratic allies may signal its support for Taiwan by including Taiwan in both bilateral and multilateral trade investment agreements, such as TIFA and CPTPP. International economic integrations has huge positive geopolitical externalities. We should not forget the Marshall Plan's success in fostering transatlantic alliances that successfully contained Soviet influence after World War II. Incorporating Taiwan into an international democratic infrastructure that is committed to free trade and the market economic is desirable both economically and politically. And third, from the predictability. We must assure that all the stakeholders that Taiwan will not act rashly. So both President Tsai Ing-wen and our Vice President Lai Ching-te have recently emphasized that Taiwan will never escalate a dispute or provoke China. Taiwan will be a force of stability in the region. On this note, I want to make clear my support for the US to endorse strategic clarity. But I also appreciate that such a strategy is predicated on US trust in Taiwan. So my second concept is pragmatism. Pragmatism in this context means appreciating the complexity of cross-strait relations. Of course, Beijing and Taipei disagree over a lot of things, but the relationship between Taiwan and China is not zero-sum. There are substantial trade and financial linkages across Taiwan Strait, and over 1 million Taiwanese citizens live in China. Furthermore, neither Beijing or Taipei wants a minor incident to trigger a military confrontation that would be a disaster for both sides. So we can start to be more pragmatic by asking some questions. The policymaker in Beijing should ask themselves whether scorched earth approach of no contact or dialogues serve China's interest. Furthermore, I have no illusion regarding China's ambition and aggressiveness. I wonder how productive it is to always demonize China. Both Taiwan and China need to return to the spirit of historical 1992 conferences, 我们俗称叫做92会谈, where the two sides set aside their differences and negotiated. Importantly, Taiwan and China need to discuss how to construct a crisis management mechanism to avoid unwarranted escalation. I do not think it's hyperbolic to say it is miraculous that we have, for the most of the time, maintaining peace and stability across Taiwan Strait for the past 70 years. 过去70年的和平其实是一个奇迹. To sustain the status quo, Taiwan needs help from its international allies. It needs to be firm, yet also flexible and creative. And thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman Ho. So now we have entered the Q&A session. So I want to first open up the floor actually to the panelists. So in case the panelists have any questions, for each other, because we hope that this is not only a panel where everyone presents presents on their own, but also a dialogue. So now the floor is open to the panelists. Yes, Ian, please.
Yeah, I just want to respond to some of the things that our Taiwanese friends mentioned, in particular about the analysis of Chinese foreign policy. I guess I disagree in a number of places. I would, Professor Tao mentioned the great changes phrase from Xi Jinping. I actually have a different interpretation of the unprecedented changes in a century. I think this is actually a more cautious statement about the or less optimistic statement about China's ability to achieve rejuvenation 2049. If you track the frequency of the use of that particular term and the adjectives that are then used to modify that term, what you see across time is an increasing connection between the great changes phrase and concepts like risks and dangers and threats. So I actually think that the great changes, if you look at the gloss by Chinese scholars and analysts about the concept of great changes, some of the great changes that they list are actually not ones that are particularly favorable to China's development or the achievement of rejuvenation in the end. So I actually think it's a concept that Xi Jinping has to state, in part because rejuvenation is a project that cannot fail for Xi Jinping. But I do think that there is an increasing appreciation in China about the obstacles that rejuvenation face, and this is the great changes phrase connected with risks and dangers suggests. In reference to China challenging the liberal order, the rules-based order, I guess I have a somewhat heterodox view, and that is I don't actually think there is a rules-based order, a single rules-based order. I think there are multiple orders in different domains: economic, trade, human rights, arms control, etc. And if you look at some of those domains, China more or less supports elements of that order. China wants to move global governance into the United Nations. The United Nations is the quintessential post-1945 international institution set up by the United States. On the other hand, in areas such as human rights, the management of territorial disputes, you could argue that China is violating many of the rules of the rules-based order, and I would agree with that. But then there's also a package of behaviors, arms control agreements, policies towards trade and investment, where China's compliance with international rules and norms is not as bad as it is, for example, in the human rights side. So I think we need a more granular understanding of the rules-based order and China's relationship to it, because otherwise you run the risk of a far too simplistic understanding of the dynamics of international politics at the moment. Finally, the question of the risks involved of Taiwan becoming involved or a central piece in the U.S.-China power transition struggle. I think that the risk of being caught between the United States and China in this power transition is more than, or is not just the possibility of a real conflict and the costs to Taiwan and the United States of the death and destruction from a cross-strait military conflict. But I think that even if there were no large-scale military actions, but you had a long time period of highly militarized but low-scale military or militarized clashes across time. But I actually think that the big cost for Taiwan is going to be the quality of Taiwanese democracy. I think a lot of historical evidence suggests that democracies have a very difficult time maintaining political freedom and civil liberties in highly militarized national security crises. The United States has lots of examples. The arresting of Germans during the First World War, the internment of Japanese during the Second World War, the limits on American cultural, social, political expression during the McCarthy period in the Cold War. And I think Taiwan faces the risk that in an ongoing, highly militarized national security crisis with the PRC that does not involve a direct attack of the PRC on Taiwan, that Taiwan faces the risk of a decline in the quality of democracy. And the question becomes, I think, and I do not speak for the Taiwanese people clearly, the question becomes, which is of more value to Taiwan and which is more value to the United States? Preserving democracy and civil liberties on Taiwan or supporting Taiwanese nationalism?
Right, so maybe let's have Professor Tao, if you would like to maybe respond to Professor Johnston's questions and points, and of course, if anyone else would like to jump in. Also, sorry, just one quick thing for all the panelists. So my guess is that our panel would definitely run overtime, but if you have to leave, by 9:30 in America, please feel free to do so. Apologies for that. It's a great discussion, and it's really hard to really cut anyone short. All right, Professor Tao, if you would like.
Okay, thank you, George. I just try to answer very briefly. Yeah, for the great change unseen in a century, I think it's true there probably will be different kind of interpretation. And as I say in the beginning of my presentation, from the beginning, Xi Jinping has totally two opposite perception of the situation CCP is faced with. on the one hand, domestically, they think they are on the verge of collapse, so there are a lot of danger and risk. And on the other hand, they think it's a time for China to rise. And so my interpretation may be wrong, but there are some people who do have the similar interpretation, like Professor Wu Guoguang in Canada. He was Zhao Ziyang's close aide and once an insider in the CCP. He also have the same interpretation that Xi Jinping is very ambitious in challenge the U.S. Global leadership now, and he would say like the great change or Dongsheng Xijiang, which are the indicator of that. And for the multiple rules of the international orders, it may be true in several other areas, but in the maritime order in East Asia, I think it's very obvious. Especially China just passed the so-called Coast Guard law in early this year in January with the protests from Japan, Vietnam, and all the neighbor countries. So all these countries are quite concerned about the rules of the sea lanes in East Asia. I think that's Taiwan Strait is also a very important sea lane in East Asia. And then finally, for democracy, of course, I think Taiwan's democracy is. I think Taiwanese people are quite cherished of our democracy, and which is a very big consensus between DPP and the KMT. No matter you prefer reunification or independence, we will decide through a democratic procedure. That is a very, very high consensus. So I think we do cherish it. Okay, thank you very much.
Right. Anyone else wants to take Professor Johnson's question, on the panel? So I'm very glad that. So I think usually for the moderator, it's always a good thing, to have some spark, right? And it doesn't take much encouragement, and there's already some sparks between the panelists, so that's great. But yes, anyone wants to take Professor Johnson's question or offer another question? Any more questions from the panel? Oh, sorry, Professor Johnson, please.
Yeah, well, if there's gonna be silence, I'm gonna fill it. No, actually, I just wanted to pick up a question that Professor Xu had, this question of identity. It's interesting. This is a methodological issue. What's interesting is in our surveys that we've been doing, we actually use two different kinds of ways of measuring identity. One is the standard traditional way that you ask people, do you see yourself as Taiwanese only? Do you see yourself as Chinese only? Or do you see yourself as having both? And you're right. When the question is asked that way, about 60% or more of respondents say that they are Taiwanese only. We also ask people using a different method where, this is a method that's been developed by Taiku Lee and the University of California, where we give people, basically, we say you have 10 points and you can allocate those 10 points between being Taiwanese or being Chinese. And this kind of reflects people's lived experiences, right? Under some circumstances, they might see themselves as more Chinese, when they celebrate certain cultural events, and other issues, they might see themselves as more Taiwanese, perhaps in the political realm. What we found is that when people are asked to allocate those 10 points between being Taiwanese only and Chinese only, actually the majority allocate points on both the Taiwanese and the Chinese end. And so the percentage of people who say they are Taiwanese only using that point distribution method actually becomes it drops to 44%. And a slight majority of respondents see themselves as both having Taiwanese characteristics as well as Chinese characteristics. And so using two different methods of identity, you actually come to two different conclusions about the degree to which Taiwanese only identity is the dominant identity out there.
Right. So I think Congressman Ho, also has, a question for our panelists.
Thank you for all the experts, the best ones from the field. And then right now we do have questions like it's from TVBS Tan Yilun. And then I myself have the question too, because when we are having this conference, Biden and Xi Jinping, they are actually having a meeting too. And obviously Taiwan and the cross-strait relationships is mentioned, predicted. We suppose it's going to happen there. So I do have a question for Stephen and Ian. What do you think, like their meeting, what's the impact for Taiwan? And then what do you expect, like they both might or might not have discussed? Thank you very much.
Yes, Steve?
Oh, yeah, sure. I suspect that they'll both present their respective positions. Xi Jinping will remind Biden that Taiwan is a domestic issue of a core interest of the People's Republic of China. And Biden will speak of the one China policy, and that being the basis of American policy towards both China and Taiwan. I don't imagine they might talk about maybe lessening the accidental encounters. They might talk about lowering the temperature a little bit in terms of the South China Sea, but I just there's nothing to talk about. Each side will present its view, and it's the view that covers some significant and dangerous differences, but they won't be either resolved or discussed, I think.
Ian, anything to add?
No, the only thing I'd add is that as a political scientist, I don't predict the future. But and honestly, I mean, we will know tomorrow. Both sides will issue their readout of the meeting, and then there will be leaks in the newspaper about what each side said. And so I imagine within a week we will know pretty well what was said.
Right. So, Professor Xu, please. Apologies.
Yeah, can I offer some sort of preliminary thoughts on Professor Johnston's proposed or evidence of a different identity pattern with a new methodology? Well, I guess partly one possible explanation is that in your new methods, respondents have the perception that they're allowed to choose or they're allowed to maintain certain percentages or elements of their either cultural, political, ethnic, or whatever identity associated with China. While in the traditional methods, I guess the respondents are sort of had perception that they are responding to a dominantly political question, which is that, when there's a choice for you to sort of choose your allegiance or loyalty, only to one or double sort of political entities or possible targets, so that people sort of have different perceptions about the sort of permissiveness of this survey. That's sort of the only explanation I can think of as of now. Just some preliminary thoughts for your reference. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you. I think that's right. In the 10, when you have the 10 points and you can allocate them between Taiwanese only or Chinese only, that it's basically allowing people to build their identity. Whereas the traditional way of asking the question forces people to choose categories. And those categories may be in people's lives actually false categories or too constrictive. So I think it's worth testing both of them. And it turns out that if you use the point system, you actually get different kinds of preferences for people who say that they are both Taiwanese and Chinese compared to people who say that they're Taiwanese only, using the different methods.
Thank you, Professor Shi, for the comments. So Yan and I, we are actually running a new wave of the survey on November 21st. So we'll have time to have some further discussions on our methodology. All right, so now in the interest of time, I want to turn, open up the floor and turn to the QAs. So I've already received quite a lot of questions, from the online participants. So I'll start with one, I start with a question, from the Zoom participants first, before, having someone who's attending the event in person ask a question. So my first question is directed for Professor Sarah Newland. So this is a question from Yun Cheng Tong. So her question, I think it's her question is, besides cautions in the Taiwanese administration about the management of cross-strait relations, is there any effort by the ruling party to improve cross-strait relations from a more unofficial perspective? The Trump administration tried to distinguish the CCP and the Chinese people. Is that a strategy that the DPP is willing to use? So Professor Newland, if you don't mind giving us your insights.
I would be inclined to allow some of my Taiwanese colleagues to take that one. I don't think I have the best insight of the folks on the panel about what the DPP is doing in terms of unofficial channels to improve cross-strait relations in sort of direct relationship with folks on the PRC side. I do think it would be good in the sort of spirit of engagement. I think it would be helpful to see more of the kind of person-to-person contacts that we see between Taiwanese cities and states elsewhere. I think it would be great if we could see more of those kinds of contacts, perhaps across the Taiwan Strait, but I'm not sure how realistic that is at this moment in time.
Any other panelists who might want to take up the question? Like we do have, I guess, a congressman from the DPP. Any thoughts on the question? Or Congressperson Johnny Zhang?
I would prefer to have Johnny answer that question first. It's a signal of being nice, right?
Yes.
The non-official measure to improve the cross-strait relationships. I think a lot of things we can do. At least the government or non-government can try to be friendly to each other. I think that's very fundamental, especially when today we are facing a very increasing tension among these two superpowers. So how to have our own communication channel or communication measures, especially among the civil societies. I think that's quite important. And indeed, right now we are already have that kind of exchange across the Taiwan Strait. So sometimes it's really depending on the government attitude. If the government, both sides of the Taiwan Strait, they are still try to encourage this kind of exchange, I think that will, to a certain degree, reduce the tension right now across the Taiwan Strait.
Okay. So I think it's my turn to answer such a question. From my own lens, from my own perspective, I do think like US and China, they do have mutual interest. And vice versa, Taiwan and US, we also have mutual interest as well. And then Taiwan and China, we totally have that as well. So that's why in my speech earlier, I say I'm not supposed, and we are not supposed to always demonize China. During the election, of course, like we will raise up like 抗中保台, but 抗中 and 保台, there are two concepts, and then they have different weights. And from my heart, from my perspective, I think protecting Taiwan should value higher than 抗中. And in the future, in the coming days, I think Taiwan should have like bipartisan consensus, regardless which party is on position in power. And then I do also see that from China's interest, they don't want war. They don't want like minor incidents to, cause a huge accident. So in the coming years from our Tsai Ing-wen's term on the presidential position, I think gradually there should be a mechanism coming up, and which will maybe formally or informally have a dialogue in between. That's something I wish, and then that's something I think eventually will happen. Thank you.
All right, so now I want to open up the floor to a question from any of the participants, at the Legislative Yuan. So we actually have quite a lot of people here. So please don't be shy. If you have a question, please do come up, please.
请坐这边哈，来，开始。This is
Here we go. Can we have it? Yeah.
And please, introduce yourself before you ask your question. Thank you.
林俊宪办公室，直接讲就好，谢谢。直接讲，不用带了，直接讲。
Hello, can everyone hear me now? Hello, my name is Anita. Zhang An, I'm the representative of my office, Lin Junxian Weiyuan, legislator Lin Junxian. Sorry, he's not here today with us because he had some responsibilities in Tainan, his writings. A short introduction of myself. Please allow me to do a short introduction. I was born in Tainan and moved to Canada when I was 14, graduated from McGill University. And okay. We would like to express on behalf of my boss, legislator Lin Junxian, that we're in support of strategic clarity. We believe that China is the player that has pushed towards strategic clarity. The status quo is changing, as Professor Goldstein has expressed, in which we believe that this is a reasoning that the US can use in the China-US, Sino-US relations. The question that we're asking now today is, what do you believe that Taiwanese government and legislators can do in the next coming years, coming days, to play a more proactive actor in the relations? Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. So anyone who might want to take the question, maybe Professor Johnson, I saw that you have unmuted.
Sure. Well, first of all, I wanted to say hello to Anita Zhang. I don't know whether Anita is a Canadian citizen. I am a Canadian citizen. So if you are a Canadian citizen, hello. I went to the University of Toronto, not McGill, although I grew up near Montreal. So let me just start with that. The question of supporting strategic clarity, I'm interested in hearing your views and other members of the panel about the question of what the other elements of strategic clarity, as I was talking about in my presentation earlier on tonight, which is strategic clarity, as we suggested from the results in the survey, leads to two completely or potentially very opposite effects. On the one hand, strategic clarity in the military sphere, a credible signals of resolve, a credible American commitment to the defense of Taiwan, that presumably increases deterrence and reduces the probability of the PRC attacking Taiwan. In part, it also increases the willingness of Taiwanese people to fight. On the other hand, strategic clarity, as we also showed in our surveys, potentially increases support for independence. Higher levels of support for de jure independence would presumably send a signal to the PRC that there is a potential threat of independence, this increases the probability or increases the incentives the PRC has to use force in some form. So strategic clarity leads to potentially opposite effects. One is to help deterrence and the other is to hinder deterrence. So my question for all the supporters of strategic clarity is, what would you do to reduce the incentives for the PRC to use force against Taiwan in addition to American commitment to Taiwan's defense? As I said, the US traditional position of dual deterrence is that the US also reassures the PRC that it will not support Taiwan independence. So my question for the proponents of strategic clarity is, would you also support, as part of strategic clarity, a stronger US position that the US does not support Taiwan independence? Because those two things, a stronger US military support for Taiwan, stronger US opposition or not supporting Taiwan independence, those together are going to increase deterrence. And so presumably you want to increase deterrence. So I'm interested in your views on the second leg of deterrence, namely a reassurance signals to the PRC that Taiwan would not head towards de jure independence.
Steve, do you want to add to Professor Johnson's? Oh, sorry, Steve, we can't hear you.
I just want to remind everybody that strategic ambiguity is a policy intended to serve the interests of the United States. And the One China policy, as it's evolved since 1979, has had as its purpose to position the United States such that it can maintain working relations with both Taiwan and the mainland. To go to strategic clarity would have a devastating effect on United States relations with the mainland. If strategic ambiguity properly configured can do the same job, strategic clarity is not something that should be considered, at least from the American perspective, if it wishes to continue to have working relations with both sides of the strait.
So thank you very much, Professor Goldstein. So now I want to turn, if and the other panelists don't have any more comments to add. Now I want to turn to another question, from our Zoom participants. So I have a question from Minzhongdang, Sunny Ho, and her question is there any potential for an alternative main domestic political division in Taiwan beyond independence versus unification? So if any of the panelists would like to comment, on the question. Yes, Congressman Ho, please.
I think this question is brilliant, and then maybe a lot of people might asking the same thing. But that is why we want to maintain the status quo, because from China's perspective, they do see this is 百年难得大变局, whatever. And so I think for the current status, there's two big power competition in between. So right now, I think it's the best solution, so-called status quo. Yeah, that's my perspective for Sunny. Thank you.
All right, anyone else wants to? Oh yeah, Ian, please.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I want to preface my comments. I'm not a Taiwan domestic politics specialist, so I'm not going to talk about Taiwanese domestic politics. I'm just going to talk about other divisions that have emerged in Western democracies. And clearly one of the most important divisions now is between liberalism on the one hand and right-wing authoritarianism or populism on the other. We see the rise of right-wing authoritarianism in Poland and Hungary and the Trump movement. And these are people with authoritarian tendencies who are hostile to visible minorities, are hyper-nationalist, xenophobic, etc. And this division actually is appearing in more and more liberal democracies in Europe, in the United States, Australia, elsewhere. And in fact, to some degree, I think one could argue that the threat to liberalism globally is more likely coming from right-wing authoritarianism and right-wing nationalism than it is coming from the PRC, for instance. So the question is that at all a foreseeable divide in Taiwan? As it's very clear it's a divide in the United States, it's very clear it's a divide in Europe, it's very clear it's a divide in Hungary and Poland and other places. Is this a concern in Taiwan? And I ask that as a complete non-specialist on Taiwanese politics.
Any further comments from any of the panelists? All right, so now let us turn to actually just one last question. It's already 10:50 here, in Taiwan. So the last question I want to reserve for one, one of our in-person, attendees. So any questions from anyone at the Legislative Yuan?
我们线上有朋友想要做任何提问吗？刚刚已经有一个电视台的朋友了，对。
Oh, and Congressman Ho also volunteered to translate if you would like to ask a question in Chinese. Anyone?
那个朱先生，你刚刚不是有发讯息？
All right. So. No? Is everyone shy? All right, this is the last opportunity. Otherwise,
I do have a question. Can we allow it to have a photo, group photo together? That's my question.
How would we do this on Zoom?
Did you see this?
Can I ask that?
Oh, sure.
Let me ask
Actually,
the final
yeah,
question.
let's have Congressperson Zhang ask the final question.
Let me ask the last question. Since the President Biden and Xi Jinping, they are now still in the meeting right now. So can I ask all the panelists, how do you think the meeting will affect the so-called status quo right now?
All right, anyone wants to take Congressperson Zhang's question?
Well, I guess I would just repeat what I said at the beginning of the meeting, that the Biden administration to this point appears to be continuing the Trump administration's approach that is emphasizing the military deterrence, strategic clarity, if you want to put that term, military deterrence to the PRC, but has paid less attention to the reassurance of the PRC by maintaining the U.S. longstanding policy of opposing Taiwan independence. And there's no indication that has changed, that this continuation of the focus on military deterrence by the Biden administration, no indication that has changed leading up to the meeting with Xi. Maybe out of this meeting, we'll wait to see whether Kirk Campbell repeats the statement he made back in July that the U.S. does not support Taiwan independence. As far as I said, he's the only senior official who has said that publicly, as far as I'm aware. And we'll see whether there's in a sense a rebalancing of the dual deterrence position, or whether it will continue to be focused on military deterrence as opposed to strategic reassurance.
I would just add that at the moment, President Biden is constrained by domestic politics or preoccupied with domestic politics. and domestic politics, particularly congressional opinion and congressional pressure, I think makes it very difficult for him to make any major changes in policy towards China. He may take it up later. That's what we're all hoping, but not this meeting. And
Right.
anyway, like Ian, I don't predict the future.
All right. Any panelists wants to add to Ian? And Professor Tao, please.
Yeah, I would like to make some comment on the strategical clarity. Personally, I don't like the debate about strategical ambiguity and the clarity, because for me, I think there is no way for the US to specify under what circumstance it will defend Taiwan, because US is a democratic country. I think when China really attacks Taiwan, we don't know how the American people will respond. So it's very hard for US government to do so. But at least this moment, because Xi Jinping's aggression, especially militarily. So I think what the US government is trying to do is to enhance the deterrence, and also with the allies who has interest in the peace and the stability in Taiwan Strait. So I think we all want US and the allies to enhance deterrence, but I don't think there could be a strategical clarity. But also in Taiwan's situation, I think it's also hard for Taiwan to say to predetermine we will have unification or independence, because Taiwan is a democratic country. Although people have different kinds of views in Taiwan, but we all respect this diverse view. So it's also hard for Taiwan to pre-commit, like we won't have independence. If China really attack, probably people in Taiwan have no choice but to declare independence. It's a hypothetical situation. Just like what happened in Hong Kong, we cannot predict it. We cannot predict Hong Kong people can be so brave when they face this kind of separation from Beijing. So we don't know what will happen in open society. Yeah, that's my comment.
Right, Professor Xu, please. Concluding remarks, maybe.
Yeah, okay. Just a very brief sort of additional thoughts on the nature of strategic ambiguity versus clarity. I guess one problem of strategic clarity is that it is not able to really prevent or deter some of the so-called gray zone military actions undertaken by the aggressors. One typical example of the gray zone military actions able to achieve decisive outcomes is Russia's paralyzing the whole communication system of Ukraine, including its internet systems. When decisive military decisions or actions happen in Russia's annexation of Crimea, okay? So, even though US may, or even US will choose strategic clarity in the future, it is not really able to prevent such actions undertaken by PLA or PRC. And when such gray zone military actions happen, many times it could lead to decisive outcomes that, even though the US is determined to come to the aid of Taiwan, defense of Taiwan, in the event of Chinese aggression, the effectiveness will be pretty much diluted or even dampened if such gray zone military actions cannot prevent it or deterred under strategic clarity. So that's my thought.
All right. So, sorry, Steve, do you want to add a quick comment?
No.
Okay, or Ian, you guys are both unmuted, I think. Yeah, Ian, do you want to have a quick comment?
No, I was saying I'm done.
Okay, all right. So it's already 10:57 a.m. here in Taipei and almost 10 p.m. in the US. So we're almost 30 minutes over. So we definitely have to end, by now. But a group photo here.
We have a projector here, so yeah, we should.
Wait, how would we do a group photo, Congressman Ho?
Give me a second.
Oh, sorry, just a minute. To have a group photo with with everyone.
All right.
Photographer now is taking a picture.
Can everybody smile? OK， 可以啊，你数到1、2、3好不好
？1、2、3，来张1、2、3。
开始拍。
All right, sorry, we have a few photographers here actually,
Okay.
Including a few people from the press.
So, 那个恒恒，你可能要当时
你是拍那个画面吧
？All together，
对不对？你拍画面才会 all together。
So are we done?
All right, we can't keep everyone in the U.S. up for this long.
OK， 好，结束。好。
Okay, all right. Have a good night, everyone, and many thanks again for participating in the panel. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Thank you.
I
Bye
learned a lot. Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
I learned a lot. Thank you.
Bye bye. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
谢谢，感谢大家，谢谢主席，谢谢。
Recording.
哦，好，是。我等一下发给你。好。那个，我们现笔友，如果说大家有什么问题的话，可以在这边聊一聊，预计会在这边待到10点。那再一次感谢，谢谢大家。我们麦克风声音太大声了。好，感谢。那跟大家就是前刚刚可能有一些技术上的问题，delay 了一些，但是原则上都非常的顺利。谢谢我们办公室的同仁这几天都加班，感谢你们，那也谢谢今天与会的每一位，谢谢。